snatcher. Here's my seaweed. There's one for kitties. Yep. Silly kitty. No.
What do you say when...
Oh. Are you starting the weird history already? Okay. Well, I guess we can do that. This is about a cult that took over Fiji.
What happened? What we do know is that the courts intervened improperly, being overworked well beyond what normal labor practices would allow, and physical punishments to top everything off.
I realized my passport was gone.
I don't know if I want to watch this one. Kitty, come here. No, monkey. Alright. Here. You want the package? Okay. He's trotting off with it. Seaweed snatcher. I didn't say Siri, I said seaweed. Relax, girl. Turn off. Goodness gracious. Let's do this then. You're so silly. I don't know why that's so funny, but like this whole ass giant seaweed package in his little mouth is so funny to me. I need a weird history, crime, something. Give me something, algorithm. I just need to pull up in the chat. Mr. Science. No. Weird history. Princess Bride. Hi, baby. Ooh, that's horrifying. Let's watch it.
Once upon a time in the 12th century, two children climbed out of a pit and sauntered into a quiet English town. That's the history. The weird part is that these particular children could easily be confused with Shrek and Kermit the Frog because they had bright green skin. And that's why today we're going to take a look at how the mysterious green children of Woolpit have baffled historians.
Hello.
But before we break out a banjo and start
How is
singing the
everybody?
Rainbow Connection, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. Then head on down to the comments and let us know what other colorful stories you want to hear about. Okay, looks like we've got the green light, so here we go. Two mysteriously verdant children climbed out of a wolf pit and descended on Woolpit. It sounds like the beginning of a nursery rhyme.
Why are you frozen? Sounds like the beginning of a nursery rhyme.
Upon a time in the 12th century, two children climbed out of a pit and sauntered into a quiet English...
No, it's not. It's not letting me use my screen. Hold on. I can fix this. I need a bowl back. Is there cat hair in my water? Probably now. Lots. That's rude. That was fresh. It's my fault for leaving it on the floor without a lid. I didn't want a lid. Why are you being like this? Don't lie.
Oh. Into a quiet English town.
Try this again.
That's the other colorful stories you want to hear about. Okay, looks like we've got the green light, so here we go. Two mysteriously verdant children climbed out of a wolf pit and descended on Woolpit. It sounds like the beginning of a nursery rhyme, but according to one William of Newburgh, who is credited with the earliest account of the tale, it's a true story that happened during the reign of King Stephen, sometime between 1135 and 1154. According to William's Historia Rerum Anglicarum, which was written sometime around 1189, the pit had been dug as an animal trap, and the children were a boy and a girl wearing clothes of unusual color and an unknown material. But even more bizarre was that they were both bright green, and not with envy. Their skin pigment literally had a strange green tint. And since that was kind of freaky, the confused children were quickly apprehended by reapers working the fields and brought to the nearby village. That all seems straightforward enough. But for what it's worth, there's no mention of the event in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which records details of English history up to the death of King Stephen in 1154. The Chronicle is full of stories about such weird events, basically making it the weird history of its day. So the failure to mention the green children has suggested to some that the event took place during the reign of Stephen's successor, Henry II. According to an historical record written by a Ralph of Coggeshall, the children were taken in by a wealthy landowner named Richard de Calne, who may have been a knight. It's hard to say because very little is known about Calne. After spending some time in Woolpit, the green girl eventually learned enough English to relay her and her brother's story. That story, which could easily pass for a prequel to The Wizard of Oz, or Wicked, was that the two came from a place called St. Martin's Land, a Christian nation where everything and everyone was bright green. The sun never shone, and the land was drenched in a perpetual misty twilight. She couldn't explain how she and her brother ended up in the East Suffolk village, but she did describe the sound of bells, which had entranced them and caused the children to lose track of time and location. One minute they were tending their flock and listening to bells. The next, they were in the wool pit crop fields. Some accounts also note that the children traveled through some sort of cavern to reach wool pit and were overwhelmed by the sunlight on the other side. While the girl could not place her homeland relative to wool pit's location, the young She-Hulk claimed that it contained a considerable river, across which the inhabitants could see a bright land, which both William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall assumed was the area around Woolpit. As for where St. Martin's Land was located, well, that was anyone's guess. Some suggested it was another planet, or an underground world in the center of the Earth, while the less imaginative assumed it was just another village in England, or maybe Western Europe. In 1998, Paul Harris published an elaborate theory that suggested the children lived in or near the English village of Fornham St. Martin. For one, the name sounds like a dead giveaway. It's also just a few miles from Woolpit, and the two towns were separated by a river, albeit one much smaller.
This is a short, weird history. There's about 6-ish minutes left of it. And this is the creepy story behind England's green children. We're just going to nerd out for 15 minutes. And then I'm going to do a bit of yoga. Feel free to join me. Maybe I'll do a reading. We'll see. I do have some stuff to share, but I might save that for tomorrow.
Girl described. That part seems convincing enough, but Harris didn't really have anything compelling to explain the bells or the tunnel. So take it for what you will. Anyway, after the children were taken in by the good people of Woolpit, they were offered many different types of food. However, the starving kids, who had apparently never been informed that beggars can't be choosers, seemed to have some very discerning tastes. Everything they were offered repulsed them. Everything, that is, except raw beanstalks, which were unfamiliar to them, which we should mention are also green. For months after that, those beanstalks were the only thing the children would eat. Of course, we've been burying the lead on the most extraordinary part of this puzzle, which is, why in the name of all that's good and holy did these kids have green skin? It's a question that has been speculated over quite a bit since the children were initially discovered, but frustratingly, there still isn't much in the way of a satisfying explanation. The 12th century populace of Woolpit jumped to the conclusion the kids were probably fairies, which were commonly accepted as real back then. Fairies were imagined to be supernatural beings who looked mostly human as far as appearance goes, and the children's account of St. Martin Land did make it sound like the kind of place fairies would hang out. Fairies were a real concern back then, due to the belief that a human could be trapped in the fairy world for all eternity. Though this situation would obviously be the flip side of that. Of course, not everyone bought the whole fairy thing. In a 1621 book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, author Robert Burton was pretty adamant the kids were aliens, saying the children likely fell from the heavens from a planet where the sun never shone. Other analyses of the incident, such as that of Scottish author-astronomer Duncan Lunan, agreed. According to him, the children probably did not arrive in a flying saucer, but had the means to be instantaneously transported to our world directly from their own. Green-skinned creatures with beaming technology? Any other Star Trek fans thinking these kids were young Orions?
We, the people of the United States.
Can you imagine?
A story which would later be adapted into Hansel and Gretel. In the story, two young orphans are taken in by their uncle, who then plots to kill them and steal their inheritance. In one early version, he plans to poison them with arsenic, which some believe accounts for the green skin. Those believers, however, are probably wrong, because while arsenic can darken your skin, it does not make you green. Another theory notes that the children were near starvation when they were discovered, and postulates that their refusal to eat anything but raw beans suggests they were probably suffering from hypochromic anemia, also known as chlorosis. This condition is caused by a poor diet that affects the color of red blood cells and can result in a noticeably green shade of skin. Whatever the cause of the green pigmentation, the accounts of William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall say that both children, or at least the girl, eventually lost the green hue after they started eating more than just beans. That being said, neither Billy Boy nor Ralphie Boy was an actual eyewitness to the events. So for all we know, those kids could still be green to this day. As you may have noticed, immigrants often have it tough, even in the past. And the 11th and 12th centuries were a time of heavy immigration for the Flemish people who traveled to England from northern Belgium. If the children happened to be among those immigrants, it might explain how they ended up alone. Many Flemish people were taken out by Henry II's troops during a battle at Fornham St. Martin in 1173. Those troops typically just targeted other troops, while ordinary citizens were often left alone. But there are always exceptions. If that's the case, it is possible the unfamiliar language the children spoke was Flemish. Due to the aforementioned mass immigration, however, it seems unlikely that absolutely no one in Wolf would have recognized it. Yes, Woolpit was a fairly small village, but it was just a few miles shy from the well-populated market town of Bury St. Edmunds. The network of roads and other paths that connect various villages and towns to the region would have brought foot traffic to Woolpit at the time, with people from all over speaking all varieties of language. If the strange language wasn't Flemish, however, it may just have been a dialect of English that was unfamiliar to the people of Woolpit. Around the 12th century, there were several different dialects spoken throughout England, depending on which region of the country someone came from. So it's at least possible the kids weren't from around those parts, and it's just that nobody from Woolpit recognized their dialect. Both William of Newburgh's and Ralph of Coggeshall's versions of the story state that the girl survived into adulthood, but they disagree on how long the boy lived. In Billy Newburgh's version of events, the boy passes away shortly after he and his sister are baptized, so we may be dealing with some sort of an omen situation here. Newburgh also claims that when the girl grew up, she got married, after which she lived for some time. But that's all he says. In Ralph of Coggeshall's version, however, the boy did not adapt well to living in Woolpit, was always languid and depressed, passing away before the two could be baptized. The girl, according to Ralph, grew up loose and wanton in her conduct, which strikes us as pretty judgmental on Ralph's part. But since he's dead, we're gonna let it slide. The aforementioned Duncan Lunan did some research into the genealogy of Richard de Calne and found a record from 1197, which may indicate that the girl took the name Agnes and married a justice, clergyman, and scholar named Richard Barr, who was a servant to Henry II. Lunan's claim is based on his discovery of a petition for land that featured names and dates he believes may be related to the Green children. While no last names were given, nor any source of the inheritance, it is believed that the petition was from Richard de Calne's son, Walter, who did have a daughter named in the record. If Lunan is correct, it means Green Agnes would have grown up into a non-green adult woman and lived a life with a prominent husband. However, research by author John Clark points out there's no evidence the record is connected to anyone involved in the Green children story. There also isn't a lot of direct evidence that de Calne ever knew anyone named Agnes, or that her alleged husband, Richard Barr, ever married anyone with that name. So while it is generally agreed the girl grew up and married, the rest of the story merits more of a red flag than a green light. So, what do you think? And do you have your own theories about what happened? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out some of these other videos.
Weird history. I want to make some tea, I think. That sounds like a really good idea. Does anybody else want some tea? I think lemon cake sounds good tonight. Lemon cake tea, that is. Delicious. Green children. It's very interesting. They were sick. It sounds like anemia to me. Green is extreme though. Usually it's a yellowish tint if there is an issue. What, Kitty? What is that? Oh, the green. You're funny. Is that what you're talking about? Let's check. Hold on. Oh, goodness. Oh. 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 I don't know. Oh, no. If I can handle a true crime right now. No. But we'll watch some more funny, weird history thing. Flying's golden age. Your Thanksgiving travel plans could be way worse. This is Bailey Sarian. It's just a mini video. Almost 15 minutes, not quite. But we'll check it out.
So in the late 1920s and early 1930s, there were no real airline attendants like today. It was like the co-pilot's job to look over the passengers. Now he was always a man, he would help them get into their seats, put their bags away, and during the flight, if they needed assistance, the pilot would leave the cockpit and help them with whatever they needed, which was super nice. But I'd be like, hey, didn't you have to fly the plane? I don't know. It's kind of sketchy, but customer service was great back then, I guess. And yeah, this was always a man. At this time, women were not allowed to work on these booby bouncer planes. Completely inappropriate. I say that because I was driving the other day. This is a side note. I was driving the other day, and there was this older gentleman who had a bumper sticker on his car that said booby bouncer. And I was like, oh. Anyways, so I had to use it because I thought it was funny. Kind of gross, but whatever. Good for that guy. So booby bouncer, no women, no. But this is when Ellen Church enters the chat. Okay, so Ellen, she's born in 1904 in Iowa, and she was just a small town girl with big dreams. She grew up right at the dawn of flying. And during the summer, her favorite thing to do was to go to the local fair and watch the plane demonstrations. She's like, wow, so cool. Ellen made it her life goal to one day fly a plane. Problem, though, was that Ellen was a woman. Yeah, and women don't fly planes. Sorry. Amelia Earhart, we know her, hopefully, yes. She wasn't even a household name yet. Which, side note, let me know, should we do an episode on Amelia Earhart? Let me know down below.
Thanks.
So instead, Ellen becomes a nurse, which is great, but it's not exactly what she wants to do. Eventually, she moves to San Francisco to work at a hospital, and I guess one of the perks of being in San Francisco was that she could take flying lessons. The other perk of being in San Francisco? That's where the Boeing headquarters was at. So one day in 1930, Ellen walks in and she asks for a job with their airline. Now, at first, the manager's like, no, women can't fly planes, But then, according to the New York Times, Ellen says, quote, don't you think it would be a good psychology to have a woman up in the air? How is a man going to say he is afraid to fly when a woman is working on the plane? He's like, I don't know what he's thinking. But the manager thinks for a second.
No.
And he's like, well, we were going to start hiring someone to take care of the passengers like they've done in Europe. So can you do that? And boom, Ellen gets hired as a stewardess. She's pretty much creating this job right here. Now, on top of that, they saw it beneficial to have her on board just in case there was an emergency and they needed her medical skills. Because she's a nurse, So she was a stewardess / airplane nurse.
He's going to
But there was a
knock her jewelry
catch.
off.
Boeing tells Ellen she can only have the job if she finds 7 other women nurses to do it with her. Passengers were getting motion sickness and many were just nervous, right? So they thought it would bring comfort to have a mother-like figure on the plane. You know, it'd be adding a sense of security to the people. Plus, again, if there was an emergency, nurse. Now, I don't know how Ellen finds 7 other women on like short notice, but she does. Okay, and she was determined. So Boeing tells her that this is probably just temporary. You know, that they would try this idea out for like 3 months, see how it goes. And, you know, I'm not making any promises. So Ellen agrees. She gets her crew together. And on May 15th, 1930, the 8 women take off on their first flight from San Francisco to Chicago, with 1 stop in Wyoming to refuel. Ooh, exciting. The flight would take just 20 hours to complete. That's it.
Step into
Just 20? That's a lot to be in a plane. Must be an adventure.
That's great. So during the flight, the women would take care of the passengers. If they got sick, they would help them with the luggage and seating. They passed out food, which was usually a cold sandwich or maybe like some cold fried chicken, you know? I guess when the plane would stop to refuel, the flight attendants, they would go like run to the nearest restaurant and grab food for the passengers. And like, yeah, sometimes it would be cold, but hey, it was still food, you know? I mean, they were making it work. You know, I wish they would have like McDonald's on the flight. Why don't they do that? Like, why doesn't McDonald's partner with airlines? I just want fries when I'm flying, you know? I don't know. I think about that. Like fast food companies, you think they would partner with airlines, right? No? Okay, never mind. I'm getting off track. That's not the point. Food is on planes. Another thing these women were responsible for, well, keeping people in their seats. And no, I'm not talking about making sure they didn't walk around. Apparently, there was so much turbulence on these planes, people's seats would come unscrewed all the time. So, you know, the women had to make sure that the seats were screwed down into the plane at all times. So I guess they'd be walking around with some extra screws just in case. Anyways, these ladies, they really proved themselves during this temporary trial. Ellen and the other women really did make passengers feel better, and they just had like...
Somebody said, this is fascinating. What is this? Bailey Sarian, your Thanksgiving travel plans could be way worse.
Experience. Now the pilot, they were like depending on these stewardesses in order to have a smooth flight, everything go smoothly and according to plan. So other American airlines decided to copy Boeing and add their own full-time stewardess. And then another war rolled around. And just like with the last war, well, if you don't know, it's World War II, okay? It comes. Just like the last war, now there were even more like advancements in airplane technology. So they made like better planes and stuff to fight in the war. And that really created the opportunity for more commercial flights to be better and more advanced. The time from around 1940 to about 1960, this became known as the golden age of flying. Golden. If you're listening on the podcast, I'm wearing a golden airplane pin. They always dress up, so I got a pin. Shut up. Anyways, look, okay, golden age of flying, great. We love that. But there was still room for improvement, you could say. Because airlines, yeah, okay, they're flying, that's great, but like they didn't know how to entertain passengers because it was just like a long, boring flight and they didn't have any stimulation, just sitting there farting. Like there was nothing. It was just like they needed something to do, so they were brainstorming. So some companies decided to put art on the walls inside of the plane, which is so funny to me. I mean, that probably even helped the rich people feel even more bougie. They're like, I'm on a plane and in a museum. Is that the Mona Lisa? Oh, champagne, please. You know, just fancy. It also became popular for a while to give passengers postcards to write while they flew, which is cute. I mean, the postcards would have an image of like the plane on it, or a picture of the destination, like where they were going. So you're like, here, write something. Like the idea was to write to their loved ones, and then once you landed, you could mail it. I'm not sure how well it did, because I mean, I'm thinking over here that the postcards probably were written all shaky because of the turbulence. They're like, dear mom, you know. But it's the thought that counts. I mean, other than that, you got art on the wall. You can write a postcard. Many would pass the time by lighting up their favorite cigarette or cigar. You know, have a smoke while in the air. Oh, yes.
I know.
The life of the rich and the glamorous. Secondhand smoke for everyone. God, it must have been stinky in there. Everyone's eyes are burning. You come out smelling your... You know when you're like around a lot of smoke and your hair stinks and you're like, it's not a wash day. But now it has to be a wash day because my hair smells, you know? That's annoying. It's an inconvenience. Anyhow, but everyone smoked. Great. Looking at art, writing postcards. It was a good time. Still, flying was considered dangerous. The ride was bumpy. The food was cold. The air was smoky. I mean, besides getting to your destination quicker, you know, was there anything else that made people want to fly? Well, I'm glad you asked. The answer when we come back.
Introducing Grammarly, like you.
Silly girl.
Flying so much was because
Where
of
is
the
your
alcohol.
decorum?
I'm sure, and like getting to your destination is pretty cool. And the fact that you're flying through the air, it's pretty wild when you think about it.
Ew.
Sometimes when I'm on a plane, God, I hate flying. I really do. I'll start thinking like, oh my God, I'm literally in the sky, in the air, and I'm not supposed to be here. And then I spiral, and then I usually have a panic attack. And then you know what the flight attendants do? If they see me, they can tell I'm having a panic attack, and they'll be like, do you need something to drink? And I'm like, yeah. That's happened a couple of times. They could see that I'm terrified. And they've given me free alcohol, which was really nice of them. I really appreciated that. Anyways, alcohol. Great. So at this point, airlines, they started to add open bars to the planes, and it was encouraged to drink your way through the flight. So this way, if you've got to sit in a cold, shaky metal tube that stops constantly, at least you'll be relaxed and not care if the plane goes down in a fiery blaze. So people would get sloshed, is what I'm getting at. Side note, is it? Kinda. Well, once airplanes were able to like heat the cabins, I guess flight attendants, they used to jack up the heat so that the drunk people would just pass out. And honestly, it was a great idea.
Can you imagine?
I don't know. You see all these TikToks and stuff of people acting all...
Literally, there's nothing that can possibly could be doing differently to make people happy. I pray you repent. That commenter said, I'm over here listening to weird history about airplanes. I'm fully covered in a hoodie. You can't see anything underneath right now. I am fully, you can't even see my ankles. Oh, am I showing too much wrist for you? Excuse me. Can you imagine? So I just want everybody to pause for a second before you take into consideration anybody's opinion. Some people come here and they try to pick me apart, and then other people come here and they're sending love in the exact same areas or topic spaces. if I was, if my legs were showing, or I was wearing less, somebody would have something to say about it. But I'm over here fully covered, and this dude is still hounding me. For what? What in this video is a problem? There's no problem. I know there's no problem. I just want you to acknowledge. No matter what I do, no matter if I change something in one direction or another, somebody would still have something to say about it. So fuck all of you and mind your business. If you don't like me or how I run my life in my living room or my house, in my life, then you don't have to be in it. VIP, boot it.
Wild on airplanes and like
Keep your
being
mouth
assholes.
shut.
Were they like that back then? That's what I was trying to figure out. Or were they like drunk with manners? Because people now are drunk and messy. Were they drunk and messy back then? Or were they drunk and classy? The research I should have looked up. But people were getting drunk. You get it. That's the point. Flying was like one long happy hour. I mean, over in Germany, they had, and they still have, an airline called Lufthansa, and they took happy hour to a whole new level. So in the 60s, you know, they were trying to rehab their image after World War II, because if you were a German company, chances are you were still being associated with Nazis. Fair. So they wanted to rebrand a little. So they had their flight attendants dress up in those traditional beer maiden outfits, and they served special Oktoberfest beer. Kind of love that, right? I don't know. So at this point, it seems like planes are becoming more accessible to everyday people.
Dude couldn't even spell his insult. Dude couldn't even spell his insult. But wanted me to take him seriously.
You still had to have money to fly, but it wasn't as expensive as it used to be. But, you know, that doesn't mean everyone was welcome. For people of color, flights were usually just as racist as being on the ground. They were usually made to sit in a different section of the plane than the white passengers. For example, if you were Black and you tried to buy a plane ticket over the phone, companies trained their employees to profile a person. And if the phone operator thought you were Black, they would put you on like a specific flight. That wasn't the only problem. The flight attendants, they could kick you off the plane for any reason at any point. Ella Fitzgerald, you know her, a world famous jazz singer, she actually had this happen to her. In 1954, she was flying from San Francisco to Sydney, Australia. She was on tour and she was like going to Australia to do a performance. Ella was Black, and the staff on the plane, they took note.
Let's not. Somebody's angry. You need to relax. Let's check out Mr. Ballin for a minute. Somebody's angry. Why are you so upset? Relax. Because you won't repent, because I won't submit to your nonsense. Oh, how cranky of you. Heard that.
Not the only young person with this big dream. There were loads of aspiring actors and actresses after all. He didn't have any real passion. Walked across the campus. In the spring of 1986, a 22-year-old man named Will walked across the campus of the University of Missouri. Will was just a few months away from graduating from that university with a bachelor's degree in journalism. But recently, he was starting to feel like he actually didn't want to be a journalist after all. He didn't have any real passion for journalism. However, he did have passion for Hollywood movies. Will had lived in Missouri his whole life, and now he was, going to college in Missouri as well. So he was pretty sheltered, hadn't really gone anywhere. So for him, movies had sort of been like this magical portal into a different world. Hollywood would show him all these amazing places and people, and so that was his escape. He loved Hollywood movies. And so with Will's senior year coming to a close in just a few months with, real life right there on the horizon, Will sort of had this big revelation that he simply didn't want to be a journalist. And in fact, what he was going to do is just drop out of college, literally weeks away from his degree, and move to California, to Hollywood, to actually pursue being an actor in Hollywood movies. But despite Will's incredible enthusiasm and naivete, when he got to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, he realized that he was not the only young person with this big dream. There were loads of aspiring actors and actresses who loved Hollywood and wanted to break in that were here, basically competing for all the same roles in all the same films. Now, this didn't deter Will. He wasn't totally shocked. Of course, people wanted to be big movie stars and come out here and try their hand. And so he went out and auditioned constantly. He didn't care what movie it was. He wanted to be in one, but he just was not getting the work. Nobody was picking him up. He was auditioning and being rejected over and over and over again. And Will was okay with that. He figured, okay, I'll get better and eventually get cast for something. But the problem was his finances. It was expensive to live in Los Angeles, and there really weren't all that many jobs available. During the day, Will really wanted to focus on just auditioning constantly. And so the only work he could reasonably take was sort of side gigs that he could work late at night or early in the morning. Except, again, there's so many people trying to do what Will is doing, aspiring actors and actresses, that basically all the side gigs in LA were sort of already taken. And so the only ones that were available to Will were like the bottom of the barrel side gigs, the ones nobody wanted. But, Will was determined and he was okay taking whatever was available. And so he ultimately got 2 jobs. He worked as a mascot for a fast food chicken restaurant where he basically would stand outside in a chicken suit and try to encourage people to go into the restaurant. And then at night, he would work as a limo driver, but for a very specific group of people. He was a limo driver for strippers who would go mostly to bachelor parties, and it was Will's job to drive them to and from these parties, and then also to go in with them and, sort of be the DJ, play some music for them. And then at the end of the night, he was in charge of picking up all the money and clothes that were kind of strewn about from the event, and packaging it all up, putting everybody and everything back in the limo and driving them back home again. Now, at first, Will just sort of accepted that this was his life, because eventually it was not going to be his life. He was going to break into Hollywood, and he wouldn't have to wear the chicken suit or drive the strippers around anymore. He could just be an actor, and he could do the thing he really wanted to do. But pretty quickly, Will realized that the opportunity to break in just wasn't really happening. But what was really happening is he was spending a lot of his time being the chicken suit guy and driving strippers around, because he had to pay his bills, and these jobs didn't pay very much. And so he had to kind of encroach on the daytime hours and work more hours during that time that he would like to be auditioning just to pay his bills. And then when he would audition, he just continued not to get cast. And so before long, it just sort of felt like he was working these 2 kind of awful jobs all the time, barely sleeping, so that he could just get rejected over and over and over again and not break into Hollywood? It was depressing. And ultimately what he decided to do was, I'm gonna quit one of my jobs. He decided he would quit the limo stripper job and just do the chicken suit job to buy a little bit more time during the day so he could audition a little bit more, and for a little while he would just put all of his effort into that and hopefully land a big spot. And if he didn't, well, then his big dream likely was not going to pan out and he'd have to move back home. But on Will's final shift as a stripper driver, one of the strippers actually said something to him that totally changed his life. He was driving them around on their way to bachelor parties, doing this and that. And at some point, Will struck up a conversation with this woman.
Oh, I need to
She was
clean
a
up that
stripper,
nail a little bit.
but
Hold
during
on.
the day, she too was trying to become an actress. Stripping was her side gig to make enough money to live in LA to try to break into the industry. It wasn't going great for her, but, she was enthusiastic and committed the same way Will was. And over the course of this conversation, she told Will that, in addition to auditioning and, working when you had to, you should also take this particular acting class. There's this one great class that all the biggest and best aspiring actors and actresses are taking, and lots of very successful actors and actresses have taken. Like, this is the one to get into. You really ought to divert some of your time during the day to going to this class. And for Will, he appreciated the input, but he's thinking like, that's not really going to help me. Right now, I don't need to learn how to act. That's going to take way too long. Like, I don't need that. I need action. I need to audition. I need to just be given a role, and then my training will be on the job. I'll learn by acting, not by training to act. However, he's also thinking to himself as he's driving around all night and she's talking about how great this class is, that he's like, you know what? At the same time, though, my auditions have not gone well. Nothing's really going well. And so maybe I'll just go to this class once. I mean, she's going to be there. She wants me to go. I'll go with her. I'll go one time. Maybe it'll be good for me. And so he agrees to go. And
That is crazy.
Thank you to L'Oreal for partnering with me on this video.
The holidays are right
It's
around the corner,
not-
and one of my favorite.
Wanting to register, hold on. Sometimes I need to adjust it a little bit. I don't know why it's doing that. It's fine. Let me show you this one. I'll be done with it. Magical fate. I'm being high again? No. Just trying to hold the camera while adjusting the focus at the same time. Usually when I show you like that, I would have it stationary and set up, but I didn't want to pull the whole tri-stand out. It's not worth it right now, but you got the gist. I promised you earlier I would show you.
so beautifully that he completely be the one really auditioning here, and it'll be in front of the whole class. It'll be, both cool to see a real audition and good exposure to the folks that are in the class. And so they do this scene, and Will, who really is just trying to play a good supporting person here, is so unbelievably talented. He's so into the scene. His emotions come through so beautifully that he completely overshadows the other actor. Like, he completely destroys them and comes out looking like the star that really he thought he was. And the agency reps were so blown away by it, they actually didn't cast the other actor who was supposed to be auditioning for this role. They basically said, no, we're not interested in you. We're going to cast Will in this role. Will basically stole the role from this other actor. And this moment would end up being so talked about and so iconic that this virtual nobody stole the show and landed this role, that people began talking about Will in Hollywood. And wouldn't you know it, it led to his big break. Will began getting cast left and right as the lead actor, the starring role in Hollywood hit after Hollywood hit. Today, Will is one of the most famous and celebrated movie stars to have ever lived. He's won everything from Academy Awards and Golden Globes to People Magazine's Sexiest Man Alive. Will is his first name, but he's better known by his middle name, Brad. Brad Pitt.
I heard some stories about him though. One, that he's abusive. Secondarily, that he I don't know, he's not very hygienic. But anyway. Extra emphasis on he's abusive, according to the narrative of his kids and ex-wife. Who's Angelina Jolie, mind you? Okay. This is that chapter. Maybe I should wait on that one. Hold on. What is that channel called? It's like there it is. Don't judge me.
Back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to look at 3 stories of people who found themselves in absolutely horrific situations and came out of them alive. But it didn't really make what happened to them any less horrific. In fact, I found one of these stories to be so disturbing that it inspired an entire video that's coming out later this month. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Hold on. Maybe I should pick something slightly later. I'll watch that later. Maybe it's the mermaid.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going over 3 horrific, once-in-a-lifetime events. These are the kinds of things you almost wouldn't believe happened if they hadn't been documented. And one of them is pure nightmare fuel, just extremely disturbing. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. At just 28 years old, Kirsty's potential as a scientist and oceanographer was just about limitless. Her resume was already decorated and lengthy, having earned a degree in geology at the University of London and a Master of Science at Southampton University before getting to work in places like Greenland and Australia. But in the summer of 2002, an opportunity presented itself that she couldn't pass up. The British Antarctic Survey, or BAS, had offered her a 30-month contract to live and work in Antarctica while studying the effects of ice movement on plant and animal life there. As you might imagine, for a scientist in her field, this was the trip of a lifetime, so she immediately accepted and got ready to head to one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. She would then travel to Rothera Research Station, which sits on the edge of Adelaide Island in Antarctica. And like most places on the continent, it's surrounded by snow, sea, and jagged mountains. As you might imagine as well, life there is unlike anywhere else, as was the work, which again was exactly what she was there for.
You find yourself between the grown-ups.
I hope everybody has a good week. Weekend. Happy Saturday. Give it another 15 minutes or so.
July 22nd, 2003, she and a colleague, Richard, were scheduled to snorkel near the shoreline.
This video is about 20 minutes long, so we'll let it play.
Checking on the progress of underwater monitoring equipment. It was part of a routine survey, and essentially she'd be checking to see how much the ice had moved since the last survey. The waters that day were calm and glassy, and the weather was clear and cold as Kirsty put on her bright orange dry suit in preparation for the dive. It was just after 3:10 p.m. when Kirsty and Richard entered the water to begin checking on their ice tracking equipment. And although they were working as a team, they each had their own responsibilities, so almost immediately they split apart and began their work about 50 feet or 15 meters away from one another. As Richard began to locate his ice tracking equipment, all of a sudden he heard a muted underwater shriek. He then whipped around toward where the sound came from in just enough time to see Kirsty disappear into the dark water as if something was pulling at her feet. He then darted toward Kirsty as fast as he could before realizing there was suddenly no trace of her at all. All he could do was stare down into the blackness below, wondering what had just happened. Then, just as quickly, he surfaced and started swimming toward the two-person shore team that was assisting them. He would then learn that as they watched from land, they said they briefly saw what looked like a struggle in the water between Kirsty and a leopard seal before she was pulled beneath the surface. At 3:25 p.m., a mayday call went out and a rescue team mobilized fast. A boat was then launched, but when it reached the area where Kirsty was last seen, she was still missing. The water around them was also just as empty and still as it was when the dive began, almost eerily so after what had happened moments earlier. But either way, Kirsty's teammates continued to scour the surrounding ocean for any sign of her, but the silence remained for another 10 minutes until something finally broke the water a little less than a mile away. When one of the team members spotted it, the sight was beyond horrific. It was in fact a leopard seal, and it had Kirsty's body face down in the water and her head firmly in its mouth. The boat then raced toward the seal as one of the rescuers started hitting the water with a shovel, hoping to scare the seal away from her. As they closed in, the seal got spooked by the nearing boat and released Kirsty, but it actually stayed nearby, circling the boat as rescuers worked to get her on board. Emergency first aid was then given, but despite their best efforts, Kirsty was still unresponsive. The boat then raced back to shore, and Kirsty was transported to Rothera's medical station, where the base doctor took over and tried everything to bring her back. For more than an hour, he tried to resuscitate her, but nothing worked. At that point, it became clear there was nothing more that could be done, and she was pronounced dead. The news of her passing hit her 21 colleagues hard, both because of how sudden and violent the event was and how much Kirsty was adored by those she worked with. Back in the United Kingdom, her family was then notified the next morning of what happened. And Kirsty's death was a first, not just for the British Antarctic Survey, but in the recorded history of human interaction with leopard seals. No human being before had ever been killed by one, and it was the first death in the survey's long history. And it was later determined that she had been held underwater by the seal for 6 excruciating minutes and dragged to a depth of around 230 feet or 70 meters. The official report also later documented 45 separate injuries, most of which were around her head and neck because the seal's grip on Kirsty's body had been relentless. And for even more context, leopard seals aren't like the ones you imagine balancing beach balls in the zoo. These animals are apex predators. They're fast, strong, and fitted with jaws that can crush bone. In Antarctica, they sit near the top of the food chain, just below orcas, which are their only documented predator. Most of the time, they hunt penguins or smaller seals, and they do so with brutal efficiency. When a leopard seal targets a penguin, it grabs it by the feet, thrashes it around, and actually smashes it against the surface of the water until it passes. And even in freezing conditions, the leopard seal is surprisingly agile for its size. An adult seal can grow to more than 11 feet or 3.4 meters long, and some have even been documented at an astounding 1,300 pounds. This is roughly the size of a walrus. And according to the rescue team that saw the seal that attacked Kirsty, it was unusually large, maybe about 15 feet or 4.5 meters long. It's also believed that it was a female because they're known to be about 50% larger than their male counterparts. Leopard seals also have sharp incisor teeth and inch-long canines designed for tearing flesh, even though their preferred method of killing is by bashing the prey against the water. Their heads are also shaped in almost a reptilian fashion with long jaws and piercing eyes, and they don't scare easily. In fact, they've been known to approach humans out of curiosity, but despite this, attacks on people are extremely rare. Leopard seals don't usually go after humans unless provoked or unless they mistake them for prey. In the official report released in the weeks following Kirsty's death, an expert on leopard seals suggests that Kirsty may have looked like a fur seal from the leopard seal's perspective as she moved through the water in her snorkel gear. Some experts speculate that the animal may have acted out of confusion or defense. The report also emphasized that no leopard seals have been spotted in the area before the dive, which is something that divers are trained to look out for. Standard procedure was to cancel any underwater activity if a leopard seal was seen nearby, and for 30 years, that policy had kept everyone safe. This time, though, obviously, it wasn't enough. The animal had remained hidden beneath the surface, unseen until the moment it struck. It hadn't given anyone a chance to react, and it didn't circle or approach the way curious seals sometimes do. It attacked fast and then dragged Kirsty into the deep, then strangely stayed in the area after letting her go. And so, this was a 1 in a million kind of event. Kirsty had followed the rules and done everything right, and still, none of it mattered. In response, the research community began reevaluating safety protocols, not just at Rothera, but across other programs operating in the Antarctic. Obviously, no one wanted to lose another scientist, but in the end, it was determined that no amount of caution or procedure could have changed the outcome that day in 2003.
Step into a new 2026 Sportage and set out on your...
Just keep swimming, swimming, swimming.
Born in 1985 in Penzance, England, Jacob was the youngest of 4 kids. His older sister Grace was 3 years older than him, but some accounts make them sound more like twins in some ways and opposites in others. Jacob wanted to do what he wanted to do, while Grace was the star student of nearly every class she was in. Jacob, meanwhile, was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age of 10 and took to skipping classes so he could hitchhike down to the beach with his friends to go surfing. He'd actually learned to swim around the same time he could walk and seemed to be even more comfortable in the ocean than he was on land. And eventually, Jacob dropped out of school, but not with the intention of doing nothing. He had dreams of his own in mind. He wanted to be a photographer, a real artist people would know the name of. As he began working on that career path in the summer of 2001, Grace was working at a children's camp in France when she began developing persistent headaches. She would then end up coming home in August, and by the next month, she was officially diagnosed with a brain tumor. The family was sure she'd make a recovery since it had been caught so soon after symptoms presented. But 6 months later, Grace's cancer was back, and this time she needed surgery in Belgium to try to remove the second, stronger tumor. Tragically, on the 18th of December 2002, Grace passed away at only 20 years old. Before she passed away, she asked for her ashes to be kept until another member of the family also passed, so that she wouldn't be alone when she was spread into the sea. Of all the things in Jacob's life, this seemed to be the defining moment. He'd lost his sister and his best friend, and in the words of his family, he'd seen how she'd done nothing to deserve her fate. But rather than being angry about it, Grace's life lit a fire under Jacob. He decided that he was going to give his all to everything he did from then on, doing all the things he had dreamed of and living a life that was worthy of 2 people. And unlike most people who make grand statements when they're caught up in the moment, he actually did exactly that. He would then go on to win awards for his photography, including National Geographic's Adventure Photographer Award. His work was featured on billboards in the West End of London, it printed on surf magazines, and known as far away as Australia. To add to that, he also took every other hobby he had just as seriously. He trained in the water every chance he could get, practiced holding his breath for minutes at a time, climbed mountains as well as caves, and traveled the world to do it. And to say Jacob was a skilled swimmer would be an incredible understatement. He was the type of person who actually taught skilled swimmers how to do things safely.
Don't be weird.
Part of a YouTube channel he ran under the name Whirlpool Hitman included instructions on how to safely interact with natural whirlpools and swim in rough waters. Others, meanwhile, show he still took a somewhat lighthearted or side interest in YouTube. He had cat videos, memes, and the occasional piece of clickbait, but his most popular video sits at over 40 million views. So while it was clear he was a consummate professional, his channel also seemed to be a bit of an outlet to be silly or to be a little edgy. And one day that took him to Hale Harbor. Just to the northeast of Penzance, on the other side of the peninsula, Hale was one of the first industrial ports in all of the UK and hosted steam-powered metal foundries from the 1700s onward. One such foundry, actually just called Foundry, was established in 1779 and built a harbor of their own to keep up with the local competition. The result was Carnsue Pool, which is a calm artificial harbor inside the natural bay, about 590 by 230 meters. Its water depth also fluctuates between under half a meter and about 3 meters deep with the tide twice daily. There was also a bridge that spanned over the entrance to the harbor with a small set of canal gates underneath them. But tidal water actually flowed in and out through a pair of stone brick tunnels underneath the earthwork dike. And because of this construction, for just a few days of the year in spring, the change in tide heights with the season turned those pipes into something else entirely. A whirlpool, a couple of times larger than a person, would form at the mouth as the tide came in faster than it could fit through the pipes. And on the 28th of May, 2013, Jacob couldn't miss the opportunity. That day was the strongest tide of the entire year.
My day was good.
Stopping by the house of a local friend of his, 7-year-old David, Jacob asked him to help with some filming and made his way down to the harbor. Once there, he set to work inspecting the whirlpool. He then put on a neoprene diving suit to give himself extra buoyancy and then spent a good 20 minutes acclimatizing to the whirlpool. He kept his distance, then gradually figured out the boundaries, the strength, and spent enough time with it that the whirlpool began to weaken with the tide as he waited for David to arrive. In the meantime as well, Jacob got some of his filming done wearing a rubber horse mask in true 2013 fashion. During which he also captured a few interior views of the whirlpool with a GoPro attached to a pole. When David arrived shortly after, Jacob explained the whirlpool to him and his confidence in managing it. And again, it wasn't like he was just some carefree surfer dude. He'd been through dozens of whirlpools before and could teach others how to do so and how to prepare for them. He just needed someone else to hold the camera while he was in there to get some shots that would otherwise be difficult.
No.
After those were shot, the last thing that needed doing was just some underwater video by hand to show the vortex with a human scale to it. And Jacob cheerfully took the camera before diving under the water to do that. Now, neoprene foam wetsuits contain thousands of little air bubbles trapped inside them, which help insulate the diver, but just like the human body, they also compress as you go deeper. Just from traveling a few meters below the surface, as much as a quarter of the suit's buoyancy is lost. Closer to 10 meters and the full half of it is gone. We don't know exactly what went wrong, but all he would have needed to do was accidentally go a couple of meters deeper than he'd meant to find himself suddenly overwhelmed. If the whirlpool managed to grab him just a little bit deeper, then it would only get harder as what buoyancy remained vanished. Jacob was quite capable of holding his breath for minutes at a time, but considering the rough nature of the 5-meter pipe he was sucked into, there would have been ample opportunity for him to hit his head, chest, or jaw and suddenly inhale water. And per a geological survey of the pool, the maximum possible flow rate was a terrifying 15.5 cubic meters of water per second, or over 15,000 liters. That's enough to fill a 2.5 million liter Olympic swimming pool in under 3 minutes. If he had become momentarily stuck in the pipe, disoriented, or simply caught off guard, we'll never know. Whatever the case, Jacob didn't resurface when he was supposed to, and as David began looking for him, a fisherman in the pool came over to assist. Jacob then did resurface face down and unconscious as the two men called 999. A lifeboat crew then arrived shortly after, and Jacob was airlifted to the hospital, but was pronounced dead upon his arrival. The coroner's inquest would later confirm that he had drowned. Originally, Grace's ashes were to be scattered with their grandmother's on Gwynver Beach, which is an off-the-beaten-path place about 13 kilometers from Penzance, where the cross on the local church is made from 2 surfboards. Tragically, the ceremony had been scheduled for the 29th of May, the day after Jacob would pass away, so in the end, they would go together.
You went to the pantry for sugar 20 minutes ago.
On February 9th, 2001, within the control room of the nuclear submarine, the USS Greenville, Captain Scott had an important mission that day. The US Navy had developed what it called the Distinguished Visitor Embarkation, or DVE program. This was a public relations campaign that invited civilians, journalists, and even members of Congress to essentially go for a joyride on a nuclear submarine. In simpler terms, it was a chance for the Navy to show off its capabilities and justify the need for these marine vessels. By 2001, this was now routine for Scott, who had led several DVE missions before, and compared to an average day of training missions, these special rides were much more loose and casual. Typically, these DVE missions included maneuvers crewmen could do in their sleep, but were meant to impress the untrained. So Scott viewed the DVE events as a chance to meet with business and political elites, and for the February 9th mission, he'd be entertaining 16 distinguished visitors. Early that morning, the Greenville loaded up with its crew of 106 plus its 16 guests, and the ship departed Pearl Harbor at 7:57 a.m. in conditions that were pretty close to perfect. As the trip got underway, spirits were high inside the Greenville, and after nearly 2.5 hours of traveling along the surface, it reached its dive site south of Oahu slightly later than scheduled. The sub then slipped underneath the waves at around 10:17 a.m. and descended to a depth of 150 feet or 46 meters. During this time, guests were allowed to sit at control stations under Scott's supervision, and he always got a kick out of seeing how impressed visitors were with the inner workings of the submarine. Shortly afterward, the visitors were split into two groups. One group would go to lunch, and the other would remain behind in the control room. After an hour, they were scheduled to switch places, with lunch service expected to end around 12:30. This was when the real show was set to begin, but lunch ran long because Scott was apparently caught up in conversation with the distinguished visitors. In fact, he apparently had to be reminded several times after 12:30 that they might return to port late if he didn't get the maneuvers underway soon. This meant that it wasn't until 1:10 that afternoon that Scott returned to the control room, and everyone prepared for what would be an exciting demonstration of what the Greenville could really do. As the captain readied the crew and the ship, fire control technician Patrick watched sonar contacts from his position. He was responsible for keeping an eye on any other civilian or military vessels that might be in the vicinity, and if the Greenville was getting too close to any. During this time, Patrick identified 3 surface vessels in the area and assigned them contacts S-12, S-13, and S-14, but none of them were any closer than 7 nautical miles or 13 kilometers away. So he would end up giving the go-ahead from his perspective for the maneuvers to begin. At around 1:15 p.m., the Greenville finally commenced with a series of high-speed turns, twists, and ups and downs. And of course, all of this would lead up to what would be a grand finale, a maneuver known as Emergency Deep. This is when the Greenville would descend to a depth of 400 feet or 120 meters, and then ascend within seconds by blowing the ballast tanks and sending the submarine skyrocketing toward the surface. The almost 7,000-ton ship would then quite literally leap out of the water like a whale, and once complete, the crew would guide the ship back to port in Pearl Harbor to end the day. As you might imagine though, this maneuver requires preparation, not the least of which included ensuring there are no surface vessels that could be affected by such a rapid and violent ascent. As Scott looked through the periscope, Patrick checked on his sonar contacts, but he couldn't quite get a read on where the S-14 was heading, so that particular vessel took his attention for an extra moment. Once he felt confident the S-14 was a safe distance away, he noticed that the S-13 appeared to be heading right for the Greenville's location. But just as he was doing this, he heard Scott announce that he had made no visual contact with any nearby surface vessels. So, figuring that Scott would have seen the S-13 through the periscope, Patrick just assumed his sonar contacts were wrong and gave the okay from his station for the maneuver to proceed. Scott then ordered the ship to descend to its target depth of 400 feet, and once there, he invited 2 of the visitors to the controls for the ballast tank blow. At 1:43 p.m., the captain gave the order to blow the tanks, which sent the ship screaming through the water column toward the surface and directly into complete disaster. What Scott and Patrick had both overlooked and misjudged was the location of S-13, which was a Japanese fishing trawler named the Ahime Maru. The 191-foot or 58-meter ship carried a total of 35 people, including 13 high school students who were planning on future careers as fishermen. As it turned out, the Ahime Maru wasn't 8 nautical miles from the Greenville like Patrick believed, despite his sonar screen saying otherwise. The trawler was instead on a collision course with the rapidly ascending submarine, and just as the nose of the Greenville breached the surface, it did so right next to the fishing trawler. A moment later, the submarine leveled off, sending its reinforced rudder directly into the fishing trawler, slicing it nearly in half. Scott then watched in horror through the periscope as the boat rose skyward before literally sinking into the ocean within minutes. Those aboard the ship who could get off were left scrambling for life rafts or any floating wreckage. Shortly after the impact, the Greenville radioed to Pearl Harbor for help, and the U.S. Coast Guard sprang into action. At first, Scott started to prepare his crew to take on any survivors the Greenville could rescue, but the seas proved to be too rough to open the main deck hatches. And not only that, but the massive submarine was making the waves of the crash site worse due to the amount of water the ship was displacing. So he had to make the difficult decision to move the Greenville away from the survivors, fearing the sub could capsize the life rafts. Sometime later, the Coast Guard would be able to rescue 26 of the 35, but the other 9 were lost to sea, including 4 17-year-old high school students and 2 teachers, making the collision the deadliest between a nuclear submarine and a civilian vessel in U.S. history.
Chevy Silverado, America's most dependable full-size pickup. And Chevrolet.
Do it. Shh, don't tell me what to do.
Following the disaster, the U.S. Navy convened a court of inquiry to investigate what led up to the collision and how this could have happened, and their findings were damning for Scott in particular. The first sign of trouble cropped up before the Greenville ever left Pearl Harbor, as the ship's analog video signal display unit was determined to be broken. This system displays sonar information, but rather than delay or outright cancel the trip, Scott determined that this was not a mission-critical piece of equipment. Had the system been operable, it's more than likely Scott would have seen the sonar contact of the approaching Ahim Maru before giving the orders to blow the ballast tanks and initiating the rapid ascent of the submarine. And second, despite DVE missions being relatively more laid back than standard training missions, it did have a schedule to abide by. And even though the Greenville departed on time, the schedule slowly started to slip away from the commander as he divided his attention in too many places. By the time maneuvers began at 1:15 p.m., the Greenville was already 46 minutes behind schedule. This threatened to shorten the most important part of the whole program, and not wanting to sacrifice any of the maneuvers for the sake of making up time, Scott apparently rushed through protocol and cut corners. Like, for example, at the conclusion of the high-speed maneuvers, standard procedure called for the ship to maintain a steady course for 3 minutes to ensure the sonar contact was reestablished and accurate. This apparently only occurred for 90 seconds before Scott ordered the submarine up to the periscope depth to perform his visual contact duties, which also inadvertently didn't give Patrick enough time to confirm the sonar data he was receiving. And then beyond that, Scott was supposed to perform a 360-degree look around the ship with the periscope for at least 3 additional minutes before ordering the sub to emergency depth. But apparently instead, Scott only checked areas where there were known to be surface vessels before the maneuver started. And by that point, the information was outdated. In 2021, as the 20th anniversary of the disaster neared, Scott wrote an 8-page open letter to the Ahim Maru families, apologizing again and taking full and sole responsibility for what happened. The U.S. Navy continues to operate its DVE program, and no further incidents have occurred since 2001. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel.
Scott done messed up. Yeah, rabbit. Team Bunny. Let's do. Fascinated by this
System in Florida. It's known for having some of the most crystal clear waters anywhere on Earth. And with a massive cave system at the bottom of the spring, it attracts divers from all around the world. As you might imagine, this has led to some horrifying incidents. As always, viewer discretion is advised.
I'm doing good, Jamie. Thanks. How are you? Doing well.
Today's video is sponsored by MyHeritage. I enjoy historical expeditions and disasters, and that's why there's such a big focus on the channel. Completely free now. If you've been following the channel for some time, you probably know that Florida is one of the best places on Earth for both scuba diving and cave diving. Because in addition to the warm waters along Florida's coastline, Florida has an abundance of something known as karst topography. This is where much of the ground is composed of soluble rock like limestone, and over time, water sources like rain dissolve this rock. This then leads to the formation of all sorts of tunnels, sinkholes, and some of the largest caves on Earth. And so it should come as no surprise that with warm weather almost year-round and tons of caves to dive in, that there are several dive sites in the state that rank among the most dangerous dive sites on Earth. Located in Gilchrist County, just northwest of Gainesville, Florida, is a privately owned nature park called Guinea Springs. Again, there are literally hundreds of freshwater springs in the state, but Guinea Springs easily attracts some of the most visitors of any of them, often to the tune of hundreds of thousands every year. Guinea Springs was once owned by a Florida land baron for many years, but once the land baron died, his estate put the land up for sale, which attracted the attention of real estate investors. Immediately while visiting Guinea Springs during the late 1970s, one of these investors fell in love with the property, but he sat on it for 3 years before deciding that he wanted to purchase the park. During that time, he had also developed a passion for scuba diving and saw tons of opportunities at the park for those with a similar interest. The investor then entered into negotiations with the estate, and basically just like that, the 600-acre Guinea Springs was born. Ever since scuba diving started to become a popular recreational activity in the 1950s and 60s, the park has been a must-see attraction for those who love the sport. The property actually has 3 main dive sites. There's the ballroom, which is a spring shaped like a bowl at 100 feet across and 15 feet deep. At the back of this large room is a welded-on grate to prevent people from going into the larger cave system it connects to. Scuba diving can also be done in the Santa Fe River, which runs right through the property, and the third dive site is the Devil's Spring System. The Devil's Spring System is also actually made up of 3 different springs: Little Devil, Devil's Eye, and Devil's Ear. Regular scuba diving can be done at the entrance to Devil's Spring, but only up to a certain point. Beyond that, the park has a clever rule to prevent those who aren't certified in cave diving from entering the underwater tunnel system. For untrained divers, there's a strict no lights policy. This is because one of the biggest attractions of the Devil Spring system is just how crystal clear the water is. It's said that on any given day, divers can descend down as far as daylight will reach and look up to the surface and be able to count the leaves on the trees. In fact, during the 1960s, famed explorer Jacques Cousteau went diving at Guinea Springs and was left with such an impression that he called them the clearest waters he knew in the world. Despite the clarity, however, there's a point where daylight from the surface stops, and the no lights rule is meant to keep uncertified divers from the caves below. The thinking here is essentially that if novice divers can't see, they're less likely to try to explore. Obviously though, in order for that policy to be effective, it has to be followed by divers and swimmers. And again, given how popular the system is, it's seen more than its fair share of tragic diving accidents. Before the investor even took ownership of the property, at least 28 reported deaths had occurred inside the Devil Spring system. Once he took over, rules and regulations were put in place, and these seemed to work for a time. For 6 years, not a single death occurred on the property, but that changed on August 11th, 1986. Brothers Gary, Mike, and Dennis were all electricians from Iowa, and they had planned to take a much-needed Florida vacation. On their itinerary was Guinea Springs, as the 3 wanted to see what all the fuss was about. None of them were trained or certified in diving in any way, so when they stopped at the Guinea Springs desk to register to fill out paperwork, they had to declare this fact. Upon reviewing the documents, the desk clerk at Guinea Springs noted their status as uncertified and told them about the no lights rule. The brothers agreed to this, and when all the proper protocol was taken care of, they left the registration desk and made their way to the Devil Spring system. While they were gearing up, the brothers were also approached by a groundskeeper who struck up a conversation. Among the questions he asked, the groundskeeper also inquired about their experience. The brothers then told him they had virtually no diving experience, so they were eager to see what it was like. And in response, the groundskeeper, just like the desk clerk, warned them of the no lights rule, and the brothers assured him that they weren't taking any flashlights with them. The thing was, the brothers had every intention of taking underwater torches with them. They weren't going to visit one of the top cave dive destinations in the world and not explore a single cave. So when they finished putting on their back-mounted air tanks and masks, they each put their regulators in their mouths and descended into the Devil Spring system. It's believed that their dive plan was to dive into Devil's Eye, then through parts of Devil's Ear before exiting into the Santa Fe River. However, 3 hours after they entered the water, under a sign that read "Dangerous Caves" along the riverbank, stood Gary's wife, Glenda. Nervously, she waited for the brothers to surface, but thus far there had been no sign of them. After waiting long enough, she went to go get help and ran into diving legend Wes Skiles, who knew the Devil Spring system intimately. Sadly, he was also quite familiar with body recovery in underwater caves, and by 1986, he had been responsible for returning at least 20 lifeless cave divers to the surface. The hope, however, initially was that he'd find the brothers alive and lead them to safety. Wes then entered Devil's Ear, swimming against the strong current that pumps 40 million gallons of water into the Santa Fe River every day. Pretty quickly, he couldn't find the men along the route they were expected to take, so he turned back around and went down one of the many side passages inside the system. It was there that he found an area that was almost completely silted out with visibility at basically zero. Then, just beyond the silt out, West found Gary by himself and he was already dead. Just a few feet away were the bodies of Mike and Dennis. All of them were wearing lights that were still on. Following their accident, things settled for a while and accidents returned to few and far in between at Guinea Springs, but things really took a turn at the beginning of 2001.
As long as donuts were made into rings, middles were tossed for more popular things. But one day, when the air smelled like pine...
Don't even start with me.
At 11 p.m. on May 7th, 40-year-old Steve anchored his boat in the SeraFae River and suited up. He was by himself and planned to do some mapping in previously unexplored areas of Devil Springs system, and he was going to do it alone. Unlike the brothers, however, Steve had a wealth of cave diving experience that spanned more than 13 years. Not only that, but he had performed hundreds of dives at Guinea Springs and was a cave diving instructor. The unknown areas of the system were where Steve thrived, and he very much enjoyed mapping out these spaces so other divers could enjoy them. What he really loved, however, was being the first to lay human eyes on these spots. Already to that point, he was responsible for 4,000 feet or 1,200 meters of newly mapped passages. Now, just inside the system from the riverside, divers encounter an ominous sign. Considering how many times Steve had entered Devil Spring, he likely didn't even pay attention to it, but it's large with an image of a Grim Reaper. If you watched the recent Eagle's Nest video, or even if you didn't, you're probably familiar with it because it's one of the most infamous signs in all of cave diving. Essentially, it more or less says that divers should turn back to prevent their own death. But again, for divers like Steve, this was hardly consideration, so he swam right by it, aided by his handheld dive propulsion vehicle, and entered the system. The next morning, when Steve was nowhere to be found, his friends became concerned and went to look for him. Knowing that he was planning on diving Devil Spring, they hopped in a boat and headed up the SeraFae River. What they eventually saw in the distance was Steve's empty boat that was still anchored in place where he left it. Trained and accomplished divers themselves, Steve's friends then prepared themselves to enter the cave, terrified by what they might find inside. On the way in, they passed by several air tanks that Steve had staged for his return trip out of the cave, and a sinking feeling came over them as each of the tanks were still full. After an hour of making their way through the winding, often tight passages inside Devil Spring, they located Steve about 3,500 feet inside. He was right next to his guide rope, and on his back were two completely empty air tanks. Immediately, this didn't make any sense to his friends. Before they discovered him, they found his dive propulsion vehicle about 125 feet away. Clipped to it was a completely full bottle of gas. Whatever happened to Steve that night inside Devil Spring was a complete mystery, as is often the case when divers die on solo dives. In the aftermath of the tragedy, there were two theories experienced divers came up with. Either Steve suffered some kind of physical ailment that caused him to lose consciousness, or he went too far in the cave and he couldn't fight the extremely strong current to make his way out before he ran out of gas. The latter, however, is often dismissed because doing something like this would require Steve to take an unnecessary risk, and he was known as a completely cautious and meticulous diver. So, what actually occurred to Steve is still unknown to this day. A year later, on March 9th, 2002, a 30-year-old certified cave diver with more than 500 log dives, Terry, visited Guinea Springs with her husband, Alan, and a friend. The three were planning to enter the Devil Spring system, dive up to an area known as the Main Line, and jump to another area called Hale 400. At this point, they'd leave staged air tanks for decompression on their return before continuing through the double lines to the Ice Palace. These are all different rooms and sections of the cave. At around 1:10 p.m., they entered the water at Devil's Ear and began what was a routine dive for them. Just as they planned, they reached the Ice Palace around 45 minutes later, using about 1/3 of the air on their air tanks. Divers follow what's called a rule of thirds when it comes to preparing gas quantity for any particular dive, and plan on using 1/3 on the way in, another 1/3 on the way out, and the last third in case of emergencies or unforeseeable delays. Terry, Alan, and their friend were right on schedule, and they started to turn back and headed for the exit along the same route they took. Around 2:25 p.m., they had just passed through a tight restriction known as the keyhole when Terry, who was leading the group, suddenly went vertical and turned around to her companions. At some point, Terry needed to switch to her backup regulator, and this is usually done in case of any malfunction with the main regulator. At this depth, at around 70 feet, Terry reached for her husband, and when she got to him, her eyes closed, and she went completely limp, losing the backup regulator from her mouth as a result. Alan then immediately pulled his regulator out of his mouth and shoved it into Terry's, but she was completely unresponsive. So quickly, Alan and their friend rushed Terry to the surface, and within literal minutes, paramedics arrived on the scene and began life-saving measures on Terry. But she would never regain consciousness. A later investigation into Terry's tragic passing revealed the potential cause for her distress inside Devil's Spring. Divers have many things to take into account that require careful planning ahead of any dive. One of those factors is gas. Beyond a certain depth, divers can no longer safely breathe the same air that we breathe at the surface because of all sorts of conditions like nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity.
Over if he smells you. Scent Killer Gold effectively turns your clothes.
Shush. Hunting season. No. Leave the deer alone. Those are my friends. Can I show you something? Come here, Monkey. This is from yesterday. It was on the Cinderella shit. It's not public. Just for me. It was just for me.
Hi, baby. What are you doing?
I looked out and there was a deer outside the window. Baby talking the deer. I don't baby talk babies. I definitely do to the cats and sometimes the deer. I adjusted my position. I had to move a little bit. And I was just feeling it out. Somebody said, why? Kind of like I do now, sitting on the wrong spot for too long. baby.
When she suddenly passed out, they were using a mix that was made up of around 38% oxygen.
That was
The
yesterday.
thing about gas mixtures, though, is that everybody is different, so this has to be calculated as part of the dive plan. Alan and their friend experienced no ill effects from breathing a mix of 38% oxygen, but this particular combination was apparently enough to cause oxygen toxicity in Terry. And keep in mind this 38% oxygen figure, because this is about to be a significant point of comparison. On August 8th, 2013, a man named Carlos arrived at Guinea Springs with his diving gear and some friends. He had ventured all the way down from Canada, and when he went through customs, agents checked out his equipment, which included a standard 80 cubic foot tank marked as oxygen. With nothing wrong with his equipment, agents let him cross the border into the United States, and he traveled south to Florida. Carlos was also an experienced and trained cave diver, but by some accounts, this may have been slightly to his detriment, as he was known as an overly confident diver.
That's dangerous.
While he readied his equipment on the shore at Devil's Eye, one of his friends noticed the oxygen tank Carlos was preparing to take on the dive and saw MOD-20 on the side.
Somebody said why.
MOD stands for maximum operating
Why?
depth, and the number
Why, if he was so confident, was that dangerous? Because you think that confidence means he knows what he's doing, right? Except for when people are overly confident or when they underestimate their surroundings, like Mother Nature and things like that, then they tend to let their guard down and they don't necessarily prepare for some kind of emergency the way that they would if they weren't as confident. They might be a little more careful if they weren't as confident, and therefore they might not get hurt, they might not put themselves in that position, or they might not get themselves in as bad a position as they would if they were overly confident and just charged right into a dangerous situation thinking none the wiser, right? Thinking they were none the wiser. To the danger.
what depth that is in feet. In the case of this tank, that meant it shouldn't be used below 20 feet or 6 meters. Since their dive plan that day called for a much, much deeper dive than 20 feet, it was an odd tank to bring. So his friend pointed this out to Carlos, who assured the friend that the tank was improperly marked. Prior to leaving Canada, Carlos said he had filled it with surface air himself. So, satisfied with this answer, it was never brought up again among the group before the dive. After entering Devil's Eye, Carlos breathed from his tank for about 400 feet or 122 meters to a depth of about 90 feet or 27 meters. Suddenly, and without warning at that point, he began having seizures. His dive partners then rushed to help him and began the process of returning him to the surface as quickly as they could get him there. When they finally got him topside, his friends started calling for help, which was heard by others in the vicinity who rushed over to assist Carlos out of the water. By this point, Carlos was no longer breathing, and despite performing CPR, they were unsuccessful in reviving him. Following his tragic death, his equipment was reviewed by 2 experienced cave divers and several members of the Gilchrist County Sheriff's Department, and they were all completely stunned when they analyzed the levels inside the tank. The mixture Carlos was breathing was an astounding 98% oxygen, making oxygen toxicity the cause of his seizures and eventual death. In addition to the number of accidents that have occurred in the spring to experienced and prepared divers, because it's a recreation area, people are often relaxing and having drinks. And as you might imagine, this is a terrible combination with diving. On June 25th, 2001, 22-year-old Christopher was enjoying a fun day at the spring with his friends. Around 11 o'clock that night, they had the idea to go for a swim. The friends then entered the water in their swimsuits, foregoing the usual dive suits divers wear, but they did wear masks and fins. They also took lights with them, and since they were uncertified, this was obviously against park rules. After a few descents and returns to the surface, Christopher's friends got tired and decided they had enough, but Christopher wasn't quite ready to exit the water yet. He stayed behind and began taking descents alone, but after he didn't return to the surface on his last descent, his friends called for help. A rescue diver quickly arrived at the scene and descended into Devil Spring, only to find Christopher dead in around 35 feet of water, right at the mouth of the cave. In addition to not having the proper gear and breaking the no lights rule, several witnesses told police that they had seen Christopher drinking prior to entering the water that night. A few years later, on August 21st, 2004, 24-year-old Brian had just started his second year as a math teacher when he went to Guinea Springs for a weekend with his friends. Brian was a certified open water diver, but he was not certified in cave diving. And late that night, much like Christopher's case, Brian and his friends decided to go for a swim, only they suited up properly and wore air tanks. His friends were only planning to open water dive, but the prospect of entering the underwater cave was just too much for Brian to resist. So after the group had descended and resurfaced several times, Brian said that he only had a few minutes of air left and that he was going to use them for one more descent. Being an experienced diver, this was a bit of an odd decision. Divers usually intend to finish their dives with air in their tanks, but Brian apparently wanted to end the night by tapping his supply out. He then descended alone, and as those few minutes ticked by without his return to the surface, his friends grew concerned and called for help. Moments later, a Guinea Springs dive instructor arrived and went to the entrance of Devil's Ear, where Brian was found dead and without air. Witnesses also claimed that he was drinking prior to his fateful dive that night.
Find the perfect gift. Wow, that didn't take long. And then there's always that one.
Much more recently, 21-year-old Isaac wasn't drinking on September 4th, 2021 at Guinea Springs, but he was surrounded by a party atmosphere. This is because he had just graduated with his underwater welding certification so he could become a commercial diver. Commercial diving is vastly different from scuba and cave diving. This is a profession with very few people employed in it because of the level of danger it can present. Commercial divers descend to extreme depths in the ocean to repair, install, or inspect marine structures. An example of this would be a deep-water oil rig. And due to the potential dangers commercial divers face, they're extremely well compensated and work an abbreviated schedule throughout the year. So this was definitely an occasion to celebrate for Isaac. As part of the celebration, swimming and diving were on the agenda for many of the partygoers, including Isaac, who just loved to be underwater. And while he did suit up with back-mounted air tanks, fins, and a mask, Isaac was not wearing any proper diving clothing. But either way, with a partner, he descended into Devil Springs. After only about 15 or 20 minutes into the dive, Isaac began having problems and his dive partner swam over to him. He was unable to get the situation under control, so his dive partner left him to seek help at the surface. But tragically, already, when rescue divers located Isaac, it was already too late. As music blared from the party nearby, Isaac's lifeless body was pulled out of Devil Springs. His family was then notified of the accident and quickly arrived at the scene to find that the party was still going on despite the partygoers being well aware of Isaac's death moments earlier. According to the family, unbelievably, many were still drinking and partaking in illicit substances while Isaac's body was lying on the shore. The family later filed a wrongful death lawsuit in the aftermath of the accident, citing that while the equipment he used was provided by the commercial diving organization, they allowed him to dive without any training in cave diving. Not only that, but the organization allegedly ignored many of the procedures and protocols in place at Guinea Springs. This included notifying the registration desk that there would be people diving that day. However, while alcohol and drug use were supposedly widespread at the party, neither were found to be in Isaac's system during an autopsy. Tragically, these are just a handful of the many deaths that have occurred as a result of the diving accidents at Guinea Springs and the Devil Springs system. As with Eagle's Nest, though, it's not entirely clear how dangerous the Devil Springs system really is. Separating the rate of deaths per dive from the total number that have occurred there is just something that's difficult to do in a niche sport with minimal centralized records. In addition, the exact number of deaths that have taken place on the property is unknown, and so is the number that has taken place in the Devil Springs system. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these stories, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. And remember to check out the link below for a 14-day free trial of my hair.
I'll give you another minute or two. Or maybe 15. Somebody's laughing. I'm serious. Ooh. Hey. Let's do... I don't know why, but okay. That makes more sense. I can do that. 2. Yes. It's the mermaid in me.
The first American lighthouse was built before the United States was even a country.
This channel is called Big Old Boats.
Tragedy wasn't far behind. First lit on September 14, 1716, the stone tower was erected on Little Brewster Island in outer Boston Harbor, Massachusetts. Its first keeper was a man named George Worthylake. He was paid £50 a year to keep the light burning from sundown to sunup. He lived with his wife Anne, his daughter Ruth, and an enslaved man named Shadwell. Far from the isolation one normally associates with lighthouses, Worthylake and his family interacted daily with passing mariners and frequently visited nearby Boston. On November 3rd, 1718, George, Anne, and Ruth went to the city to attend church. After the service, the family boarded a sloop and headed back to the lighthouse. They were joined by a worker named George Cutler and a family friend, John Edge. As they approached Little Brewster Island, the sloop dropped anchor and waited for Shadwell, who paddled out to the sloop in a small boat to ferry the party to shore.
You need to go, please.
But as they climbed into the small boat, already overloaded with supplies,
Cats!
it violently turned over,
Cats
throwing
everywhere.
everyone into the churning waves.
My muffin.
They all quickly drowned. The Worthylake family was buried at Copp's Hill Burying Ground in Boston. Within just 2 weeks, Captain George Saunders, George Chamberlain, and a man named Braddock were hired to replace the ill-fated keeper and maintain the critical light. Only a few days after they took up their new position, a brutal storm swept over the harbor. As the wind and rain howled outside, Captain Saunders sighted a ship coming in from the sea. The men on board put out a signal, and thinking they were in need of a pilot to help navigate the harbor entrance, the three keepers braved the storm. They boarded a small boat and paddled out to offer their assistance. But upon reaching the ship, the captain waved them away. He had only signaled because he wanted news. Frustrated, the three men turned back to the light. But as they neared the shore, a massive wave lifted their small boat and threw the men into the sea. Chamberlain was thrown around by the waves, but eventually he managed to get his head above water. He finally caught sight of the shore and swam forward. It took every ounce of strength to drag himself onto the rocks and out of the pounding surf. He collapsed on a large boulder, and once he caught his breath, he looked back at the sea, hoping to find his fellow keepers. But he was alone. Captain Saunders and Braddock both drowned. The story of Boston Light and its ill-fated early keepers inspired Benjamin Franklin, just 12 years old at the time, to write a poem called The Lighthouse Tragedy. Unfortunately, the poem is believed to be lost. Despite its tragic start, Boston Light continued on. Even after the light was destroyed during the Revolutionary War, the tower was rebuilt and lit in 1783. Boston Light is the second oldest lighthouse in the United States, and the only one still manned by the Coast Guard. Its deadly beginning would be echoed at lighthouses throughout the country for years to come. I want to take a moment to talk about the sponsor of this portion of today's video, Opera. As you might imagine, my job involves a lot of time online, and for quite a while now, Opera has been my default browser. I'm a team of one, and I need every tool I can find to help me sort through the chaos of the internet. Opera is faster, safer, and smarter. It offers a huge suite of constantly improving features built for better music and video playback, tab capabilities, and gorgeous themes.
Ouch.
It was just after midnight on Friday, March 6, 1886, when the growing port town of Escanaba, on the northwest tip of Lake Michigan, awoke to ringing alarm bells. The town's light station, Sandpoint Light, was completely engulfed in flames. The horrified town raced to put out the fire. Time was of the essence. One of the only female lighthouse keepers in the United States, was trapped inside the tower. The town of Escanaba, Michigan was established in 1863 and quickly grew as an important shipping port once the Peninsula Railroad was completed in 1864, connecting the port to iron mines on the Upper Peninsula. Growing demand for iron ore sent a steady stream of bulk freighters to the growing port, but the harbor entrance was dotted with sandy shoals, making it difficult to navigate. As traffic increased, it became clear that a light was needed to guide ships into port. The United States Lighthouse Service soon approved a new lighthouse and allocated $11,000 for its construction, which began in the fall of 1867. The structure was completed the following spring, and the light was first lit on May 13, 1868. Called the Sandpoint Light, the new structure consisted of a simple rectangular building and an attached brick tower, topped by a cast iron lantern room. The tower contained a fourth order Fresnel lens with a focal height of 44 feet or 13 meters. The original light was a solid red beacon that could be seen for up to 11.5 miles. Oddly, the lighthouse is unique in that its tower sits facing land rather than the water. Whether this was an intentional decision or a mistake is unknown. While the lighthouse was still under construction, a local Escanaba resident, John Terry, was appointed keeper. He and his wife Mary moved to the tower, but in April, just before the light went into operation, John Terry suddenly died of tuberculosis. Despite fierce opposition from the lighthouse service, the town banded together and insisted that Mary should remain at the lighthouse and assume her husband's job. She was one of the first female lightkeepers in the Great Lakes region. It was soon abundantly clear that the town had made the right decision. For 18 years, Mary diligently carried out her duties. She was well respected in the community, and several articles from the time commended her service, often remarking on her level-headed care for the critical light. Through storms, bitter cold, and every conceivable hurdle, Mary kept the beacon shining. So it was a major shock when the town awoke on the night of Friday, March 6, 1886, to find the Sandpoint Light completely engulfed in flames. Rescuers raced into the burning tower, desperately searching for Mary. But to their horror, she was nowhere to be found. They went to work putting out the flames, all the while hoping that they might find the missing keeper. But as the first light of dawn illuminated the scene, one of the volunteers made a grisly discovery. Mary Terry did not survive the fire. Her remains were discovered, buried in the smoldering remains of the light station she dedicated her life to serving. Attention immediately moved to investigating what happened. The circumstances of the tragedy led many to believe that the fire wasn't an accident. Those familiar with Mary and her work found it incredibly hard to believe that she would be careless enough to cause such a devastating fire. It was widely known that Mary lived alone at the lighthouse. She was also known to be reasonably wealthy after inheriting some money and property following her husband's death. She also had no children and kept a job that provided her room and board, so she was able to save a considerable amount of her earnings. The Escanaba Iron Port declared that, quote, "It is easier to believe that the burning of the house and her death is the outcome of a scheme of robbery than to believe it an accident." A coroner's jury was quickly assembled to investigate the tragedy.
The bespoke AI laundry combo washes and dries in only 68 minutes. Even smarter with smart things.
Shush.
Many in the town believed that someone broke into the lighthouse to steal Mary's money and set fire to cover their tracks. When rescuers arrived at the burning lighthouse, they found the south door to the building standing wide open, quote, with the bolt shot forward as though the door had been forced, not unlocked. But none of Mary's belongings seemed to be missing. Her papers and deeds were partially burned, but sat undisturbed. And the gold pieces that she had saved over the years sat on the floor beneath the burned-out cupboard where they were stored. If someone meant to rob her, why would they leave all her valuables behind? Mary's cause of death was never able to be determined. The lighthouse was almost completely destroyed in the fire. Only the spiral staircase to the lantern room remained untouched. Mary's remains were reduced to almost nothing but bone fragments. These were examined, but there was not nearly enough left to make any real determination. But it was noted that Mary's remains were found at the southeast corner of the building, not in her bedroom at the north end. The day before the fire, a handyman named Boardman Layton visited the lighthouse to do some work on the building. As he was leaving, he claimed that he noticed some firewood stacked close to the furnace that he thought looked hot. He testified that he pointed this out to Mary, but that she didn't take it seriously.
No.
And apparently responded by saying she expected to be burned out by it someday. And also apparently added that she slept with one eye open. The jury suspected that Layton might have exaggerated this interaction and thought that he might have embellished his story for attention. The casual disregard seemed very out of character for Mary, and the timing of the conversation seemed to be convenient. But no one went so far as to suggest that Layton might have been involved in anything more than simple storytelling. In the end, the jury failed to reach any definitive conclusion. Was the fire at Sandpoint Light a terrible accident? Did some fortune seeker break into the lighthouse, hoping to find a cowering, defenseless woman, only to get caught off guard when Mary fought back? Maybe the intruder panicked and knocked her unconscious, or worse, and set the fire to the building to cover its tracks. In the end, we'll never know. No matter what happened that night, Mary Terry was part of an exclusive group of women lighthouse keepers. Less than 3% of keepers and assistants on the Great Lakes were women. For 18 years, Mary served with distinction and proved her doubters wrong. That record should be her legacy. After the fire, the Sandpoint Light was quickly rebuilt. The light remained in service, cared for by 9 different keepers until 1939, when it was deactivated by the Coast Guard and converted into housing. The building remained with the Coast Guard until 1985, when it was leased to the Delta County Historical Society. After an extensive restoration project, the lighthouse was opened to the public in 1990. During the summer months, visitors are still welcome to visit the lighthouse. When we think about a lighthouse, we typically picture a stone tower sitting on some bluff high above the sea. But for some reason, we seldom imagine a lightship. These modest vessels, anchored in key locations to warn of dangerous shoals and other hazards, had to remain at their posts through the worst storms imaginable, even when significantly larger ships would be forced to seek shelter. One of these dependable little ships was the Buffalo Lightship No. 82. Built in 1912 at the Racine Truscott Shell Lake Boat Company in Muskegon, Michigan, Lightship No. 82 was built like a tank. Small but mighty, she measured 95.2 feet or 29 meters in length, with a beam of 21 feet or 6.4 meters and came in at 187 tons. She was powered by a small coal-fired engine capable of generating just 90 horsepower, enough to maneuver the ship, but not really enough to cover any real distance. Tugs were generally required to move the ship on and off her station. While lightships needed to weather fierce storms, their biggest threat were collisions with other vessels. All over the world, captains aimed their ships directly at lightships to set their course. Most would adjust with plenty of time to spare, but sometimes they didn't. 150 lightships were involved in major collisions, 5 resulting in the loss of the lightship. The most famous example was when Titanic's sister ship, RMS Olympic, sliced through the Nantucket lightship in 1934, killing 7 of the 11 men on board. Because of this, lightships were built tough, strong enough to survive a collision, so long as it wasn't with a 45,000-ton superliner. The lightship Buffalo was equipped with a reinforced steel hull, a whaleback forecastle deck, a single lantern mast forward, and a small fore and aft rigged jigger mast on the stern that could be used to help steady the ship.
Oh, shit.
Life on a lightship was tough, significantly more challenging than what the average lightkeeper tended to face. But efforts were made to make life on board bearable. Buffalo had a crew of 6. The captain and mate each had their own cabin in the stern. The other 4 crew members were quartered on the
1:22 on the
berth
clock
deck.
on the East Coast.
Library chests were regularly rotated to give the men something to occupy their off time and distract them from the isolation.
Pardon me.
The lightship was held firmly in place by 4 large mushroom anchors. But this didn't stop the near constant rocking that tousled the small ship, even in relatively calm conditions. Crew bunks were sloped to keep the men from falling out in heavy seas. It was a constant battle keeping dishes on the table during meals. The rolling was just something that the men had to try and get used to, but even experienced sailors who were used to the constant forward motion of a typical ship would sometimes struggle with seasickness on these stationary vessels. The crew's number one job was to keep the light illuminated at night and clean the lens during the day. Maintenance, cleaning, and other duties typically took up the rest of their time. The lightship Buffalo cost $42,910 to build and went into service in 1912. She was stationed off Point Abino, Ontario, to help guide vessels to the harbor at Buffalo, New York on Lake Erie. For just under a year, she served diligently, safely guiding hundreds of ships into the harbor. But her time on Lake Erie proved to be tragically brief. By November 1913, 6 men worked on the lightship. They included Captain Hugh M. Williams and mate Andrew Leahy. Andrew's brother Cornelius Leahy worked as assistant engineer. They were joined by Chief Engineer Charles W. Butler and 2 crewmen, William Jensen and Peter Mackey.
So let me get this straight. You mean some random rich white boy? He's Italian. So some random rich spicy white...
Racist bitch. Shut the front door. Nobody wants to watch your ass. Not me. Especially when you're up my
On
yoga
November
session.
6, 1913, 2 storm systems converged over Lake Superior and moved east
Where's your
across the
decorum?
Great Lakes. Unofficially dubbed the White Hurricane, the storm is widely considered to be the worst in the history of the Great Lakes. By November 9th, the storm reached its peak strength over Lake Huron, sinking 8 different ships, including some of the largest vessels in the lakes at the time.
She played the Little
In
Mermaid.
the coming days,
How
the
rude.
storm
They didn't have
destroyed
my
19
documentary.
ships, damaged 52 others, and killed over 250 sailors.
Thank you.
By the time it reached Lake Erie, the storm had weakened considerably, but it was still a force to be reckoned with. Throughout the storm, Lightship Buffalo remained in position.
Mind you, that was a bunch of black women on the screen running their mouths. Interrupting a yoga session and a good ocean documentary. How are you going to play The Little Mermaid and then pull that shit? Not today. You want to be the first black Little Mermaid. And then promote racism of any kind? No.
She was designed to weather the worst that the lakes could throw at her, and this would certainly put her to the test. At first, she held up well to the building northwest seas. But as wave after wave slammed into the small ship, the situation quickly fell apart as the storm grew closer.
No.
Because Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, even mild weather has the capacity to whip up monstrous waves out of nowhere. The small lightship, firmly anchored in place, would have been battered relentlessly. Eventually, the onslaught began to tear the ship apart. It would have been hell on board as she was violently thrown about. Pumps would have been deployed to keep pace with the flooding. But then, to the horror of the 6 men trapped on board, her mighty anchor chains finally snapped, leaving the lightship at the mercy of the storm. Horrifically underpowered, the tiny ship was left helpless, even if the crew managed to start her engine. Whether they managed to fight back at all will never be known. By the early morning hours of November 11th, the worst of the storm had passed. At 3 a.m., the downbound steamer Champlain searched for the light as they sailed through the clearing storm. But when they passed the site of her anchorage, the lighthouse was nowhere to be seen. At first, no one believed that the brand new ship could have been lost in the storm. It was thought that she had simply broken free from her anchorage and drifted to some far-off place. But as time went on and the lightship failed to materialize,
I think my body's done
concern
for
began to
tonight.
grow. Then, debris began washing ashore.
I was tired when I started.
Broken railing, shattered wood from her deck houses, even a life jacket with her name stenciled across the front. The most ominous was a splintered panel bearing a hastily written message.
You know
It
what
read,
it is? It's my
"Goodbye,
fucking
Nellie.
hip that's out of the
The
socket.
ship is breaking up fast.
I can't
Williams."
properly get that.
It was the captain's final message to his wife. His body
There it
washed
is.
ashore
God damn it.
just a few days later.
You're gonna
Almost
pay
a
for that,
full year
Carmex.
after the
That is
tragedy,
a
on
result
October
of
29,
domestic abuse long term.
1914,
You're gonna get it
Charles
for that.
W. Butler was found in the Niagara River, 13
I'm
miles
moving on.
away. But by then, the wreck had already been found.
You will suffer under
On
God's
May
wrath.
9, 1914,
For starters.
a U.S. lake survey vessel using a wire sweep
Instead of a
discovered
port.
something laying on the lake bed some 36 feet below the surface, just under a mile away from the lightship Buffalo's mooring site.
Let's try that again, shall we?
A diver was sent below to investigate and soon confirmed that it was indeed the wrecked lightship. After 2 failed salvage attempts, the ship was raised on September 16, 1915. While her deckhouses were almost completely destroyed, the ship's sturdy hull was in good condition. There were no bodies found in or near the wreck. It was determined that the ship could be repaired and returned to service, though not to her original post. Her station off Buffalo remained unmarked until lightship number 98 was placed at the mooring in October 1916. Meanwhile, lightship 82 was almost completely rebuilt. She served as a relief ship for the 10th District from 1917 to 1925 when she was moved to the 11-foot shoal on Lake Michigan, where she served her original role as a lightship until 1936, when she was finally decommissioned. For the next few years, she served as housing for veterans. But in 1945, she was destroyed by a fire set by vandals. She was scrapped soon after. Overshadowed by the dramatic tragedies that preceded the death of her crew in 1913, the tiny lightship, once miraculously retrieved from the abyss, was torn apart and discarded. almost every lighthouse has a ghost story, but only a handful become ghosts themselves. These towers were built to last. Their purpose was vital. In a time before GPS and radio direction finding, a simple beacon could be the difference between life and death. Reliability was the point. Each had a unique signature so that mariners could be sure what light they were looking at, so that they could pinpoint their location and chart a safe passage. Through rain, shine, snow, sleet, and even brutal hurricanes, lighthouses.
As long as donuts were made into rings, middles were tossed for more popular things. But one day,
you need to relax. Stop spamming people.
Bastion of order, a beacon in the storm. And that's why today, so many of these towers remain.
Donut holes. Get out of here.
The approach to the Straits of Mackinac is a treacherous one. As cities like Milwaukee and Chicago grew and traffic increased on Lake Michigan, the stretch of water at the north end of the lake that connected Lake Huron and the rest of the Great Lakes proved deadly. By the 1820s, it was clear that something had to be done about the rocky shoals that dotted the lake leading up to the busy strait. The vast shoals around Waugoshance Point at the northeast corner of the lake proved particularly challenging, with numerous ships wrecking in the area every season. Waters were often less than 12 feet deep and dotted by ledges and jagged rocks. Navigators appealed to the federal government for a solution to the problem. But marking the deadly shoals would be difficult. It was agreed that an offshore lighthouse would be ideal, but establishing such a structure in the area would be an immense challenge. In 1832, a small wooden lightship called the Louis McLean was anchored in the area to temporarily mark the shoal until a more permanent solution could be determined. She ended up marking the area for 19 years. Throughout that time, the small ship suffered more than her fair share of damage as she was battered by storm after storm. But still, through the grit and determination of her tiny crew, she endured. In the meantime, plans began taking shape for a more ambitious structure. The new lighthouse was approved in 1850. On the nearby St. Helena Island, a massive timber crib that measured 32 by 60 feet was constructed. Once completed, the crib was towed to a carefully selected site on the Waugoshance Shoals. It was then filled with massive stones and sunk to its foundation on the reef. A cofferdam was then constructed around the crib, and water was pumped away. Cement and intricately cut limestone slabs were then laid down to provide a strong base on which a 76-foot brick tower was constructed. It was the first project of its type built on the Great Lakes. At its base, the tower had a diameter of 20 feet with 5.5-foot thick walls. At the parapet, the tower narrowed to 15 feet 2 inches with 2-foot 1-inch thick walls. The tower featured a birdcage-style lantern, which was briefly popular at the time, but quickly fell out of favor. Inside was a powerful 4th-order Fresnel lens, the first to be installed on the Great Lakes. Its beam flashed every 45 seconds and was visible for up to 16 miles. At its base, a simple structure that housed the keepers and equipment hugged the tower. Construction was brutal, as workers contended with ever-changing weather conditions and the grueling demands of erecting a tower on a narrow ledge surrounded by churning water. It's rumored that at least one worker was killed before the tower was complete, but no records confirm the story. The lighthouse entered service in 1851, and the Louis McLean was moved to Bar Point Shoal on Lake Erie before she sank in a storm in 1874. From its earliest days of operation, the Waugoshance Shoal Light proved a difficult assignment, not only for the men tasked with maintaining the light, but also for the tower itself. From 1867 to 1870, the lighthouse underwent a major renovation to stabilize the base and add a 45 by 66-foot limestone pier. In 1883, a badly needed foghorn was added, Before that, keepers had to manually ring a bell in foggy conditions to warn ships away from the shoals. In 1871, while the Great Chicago Fire raged at the other end of the lake, keepers had to continuously ring the bell as a thick wall of smoke blanketed the shoals. By the 1880s, the crib and tower both began to show worrying signs of age and decay, and another major project was undertaken to shore up the lighthouse. The brick keeper's quarters were encased in riveted cast iron boiler plating to protect it from the lashing storms and ice. It created a foreboding fortress that surrounded the brilliant red and white striped tower. The isolated lighthouse proved challenging for the people who lived and worked there. The 1880s seemed particularly brutal. Albeit rare, keepers and their assistants were occasionally joined by their wives. In the summer of 1883, Clara Hayman Davenport, wife of assistant keeper Andrew Jackson Davenport, was filled with dread when she first caught sight of the ominous tower. After only a few days of living in the lighthouse, she became convinced that it was haunted. Doors would open and close on their own. The building creaked and moaned with the passing wind and waves. The terrible sounds reminded her of the cries of the men who lost their lives on the rocks below. Eventually, she grew too afraid to be left alone, and she would follow her husband up the stairs to the lantern room as he carried out his work. Fortunately for her, her time at the lighthouse was brief. Her husband was transferred to the Twin River Point Lighthouse in Wisconsin later that year. Misfortune would come to the lighthouse soon after their departure. The year before, Thomas Marshall arrived at the lighthouse after he was appointed acting keeper. He was promoted to head keeper the following June. Traveling to and from the lighthouse was always dangerous. On May 28, 1886, Marshall left Mackinac Island in a small sailboat, towed by a ship called the E. Faxton, and headed for the lighthouse. But soon they were overtaken by a sudden squall. Marshall's tow line disconnected, and the small boat disappeared in the rising and falling waves. Later, a ferry called the Chrysler came upon the overturned boat. The 48-year-old keeper was nowhere to be found. His body was never recovered.
We're following developing deals at Old Navy.
And coming up next, are metallics the new...
No. So awful. So spammy. Sorry, at least they're getting paid.
It's registering a business.
Oh, sugar, like double spammed us. Like I said.
But Thomas Marshall wouldn't be the last Waugoshant's keeper to meet an untimely end. John Herman first arrived at the lighthouse in April 1887 to serve as an acting assistant keeper. He gradually worked up the ranks and became head keeper in 1892. While Herman carried out his duties admirably at the isolated lighthouse, over the years he gained a reputation for drinking heavily while on leave and playing pranks on his fellow keepers. The story goes that on Sunday, October 14th, 1900, Herman returned to the lighthouse still intoxicated after a multiple day-long bender and ended up locking his assistant keeper in the tower as a prank. The assistant was not amused. He banged on the door, calling for Herman to unlock it. But soon, the keeper's laughter disappeared. The assistant climbed the tower to see what was happening. He looked over the edge just in time to see the drunken man stumbling around the pier and vanish around a corner. The assistant waited, but Herman never reappeared. Finally, he was able to flag down keepers from a Gulpin Point lighthouse who were able to rescue him. The men searched for the drunken keeper, assuming that he had passed out somewhere, but he was nowhere to be found. They soon realized that Herman probably stumbled off the pier and had fallen into the churning lake. Even before these tragedies, Waugoshant's Light already had a reputation. Keepers dreaded working at the old tower, and it wasn't just because of the intense isolation. The lighthouse was known to creak and groan, and sometimes men thought they heard whispers alone in the tower late at night. There was an eerie energy to the place, something darker than the loneliness felt at other beacons. The death of John Herman only added to the mystique. After his passing, stories circulated of moving chairs, slamming doors, silverware rattling in drawers. One story even claimed that coal was shoveled into the furnace while no one was around. In its final years, it became increasingly difficult to find men to work in the lighthouse. Some even say that the hauntings are what led to the tower's closure. But this wasn't true. As freighters grew larger and holes moved from wood to steel, the route past the Waugoshant's Light became more difficult to safely navigate. The shipping routes soon moved approximately 4 miles north, where the water was deeper and safer for the ever larger lake freighters. This new passage contended with another hazard, the White Shoal Reef. In 1878, a derelict ship was anchored in the area to warn passing ships. This was soon followed by a lightship. But it was clear that a more permanent solution was needed. Finally, in 1908, construction began on a new offshore lighthouse. Commissioned on September 1st, 1910, the White Shoal Lighthouse stood at 125 feet, the tallest lighthouse on the Great Lakes. Many of the lessons learned from Waugoshant's and other offshore lights like Spectacle Reef, Standard Rock, and many others were incorporated to build a dependable modern structure. The new lighthouse made Waugoshant's Light obsolete, and the tower was decommissioned shortly after in 1912. On June 30th, the last keeper, Everett Sterrett, and assistant keeper, Frederick Kohler, extinguished the light for the last time. It wasn't some poltergeist or supernatural force that closed the Waugoshant's Light. It was simple obsolescence. But it's easy to see how the derelict tower gained its supernatural reputation. Left to rot in the punishing waves of Lake Michigan, the lighthouse quickly fell into disrepair. In World War II, it was briefly used as target practice for fighter pilots practicing methods to counter Japanese kamikaze pilots. But mostly, the tower just sat empty. Today, what remains of the lighthouse looks like something out of a horror movie. There were attempts to save and even restore the historic structure. But as sea levels rose and fell, and storm after storm punished the bricks and stones, it became clear in the last few years that the Waugoshant's Light could not be saved. The piers around its base have long since crumbled away, and the crib that serves as its main support is falling apart. The end could come at any moment. There's even a chance that when you watch this video, the tower will have already collapsed. Life has already passed it by. Its purpose has long since been eclipsed. Now, like a spirit, it lingers after death, offering a disquieting glimpse into the abyss.
Please remember to pray. Do no harm, take no crap, and I will most indubitably catch you on the next one. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being you. Thanks for nerding out with me. Sweet dreams. Blessings and namaste.